You are watching this on the morning after the United States military conducted its 13th consecutive night of strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran. 13 nights in a row. No pause, no diplomatic timeout, no humanitarian corridor, no congressional authorization. 13 unbroken nights of American air power descending on Iranian soil, and the man ordering those strikes told Axios yesterday, in language that should have stopped the world, that he is considering a massive attack on Iran, that he is close to making a decision, and that Israel would join in 2 minutes if I asked them to. That sentence is not hyperbole. In the context of this war, at this stage of this conflict, with this operational tempo, with oil cresting back above $100 a barrel, for the first time in 2 months, that sentence is a countdown. To understand why what is happening right now is more dangerous than anything we have seen since this war began on February 28th, you need to understand what the 13th night actually means. Not symbolically, operationally. Because the media framing of these strikes as a continuation of the same campaign that began in July misses the critical inflection that happened in the past 72 hours. The inflection that has pushed this conflict from a grinding war of attrition into something that every energy trader, every naval commander, every intelligence analyst in Washington, Riyadh, Beijing, and Moscow is now watching with a very specific and very controlled kind of terror. The ceasefire did not simply collapse, it was dismantled, methodically, by both sides, through a cycle of violations, counter-violations, and deliberate escalation decisions that left the Memorandum of Understanding negotiated in May as nothing more than a diplomatic artifact, a document that was never truly honored by either party and is now functionally dead. What replaced it is not a war with clear front lines and defined operational objectives. What replaced it is something far more unstable, a sustained kinetic campaign operating alongside continued, and now seemingly hopeless, diplomatic outreach in which every night of American strikes makes the next diplomatic opening harder to sustain, and every Iranian counterstrike makes Trump's domestic political position more dependent on further military escalation. This is the mechanism that produces catastrophic wars, not sudden decisions, not single provocations, but the gradual, cumulative, operationally logic-driven elimination of every de-escalation pathway until the only options remaining on the table are the ones that nobody in a rational peacetime environment would ever choose. Now, let's talk about what CENTCOM actually struck on the 13th night. The formal statement released by United States Central Command was precise and carefully worded, as these statements always are, to communicate maximum operational accomplishment while revealing minimum operational detail. CENTCOM said it targeted Iranian military command centers, drone storage facilities, communication networks, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities, with the explicit stated objective of further diminishing the threat Iran poses to civilian mariners and commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The geographic focus has shifted. Earlier in this campaign, strikes were concentrated in southern Iran, around Bandar Abbas, Qeshm Island, the coastal surveillance and drone launch infrastructure that Iran has used to interdict shipping in the Strait. But the Institute for the Study of War, in its most current analytical update, confirmed that American strikes have increasingly moved into western and northwestern Iran, an expansion of the target set that carries enormous operational and escalatory significance. Because western and northwestern Iran are not coastal infrastructure. They are not drone storage facilities near the Strait. They are the internal military architecture of the Iranian state, command nodes, communications networks, missile production infrastructure sitting hundreds of miles from the Strait of Hormuz, in territory that Iran's remaining military and political leadership almost certainly considers inviolable. Striking there is not maintaining a status quo. It is advancing into Iranian sovereign depth in a manner that changes the psychological and operational calculus of the conflict in ways that no press release adequately communicates. And simultaneously, Iranian state media reported that American strikes on Khuzestan province, the southwestern oil-rich heartland of Iran, killed at least 4 civilians in the vicinity of Avaz. Iran's military responded by launching what it described as a new wave of drone attacks against U.S. facilities in Bahrain and Jordan, targeting, according to Iranian military statements, fuel storage tanks, equipment, warehouses, troop living quarters, and aircraft hangars at Sheikh Issa Air Base in Bahrain. This is the definition of mutual escalation in real time. American strikes pushing deeper into Iranian territory, Iranian drone retaliations hitting American installations across the Gulf on the same night, oil at $100 a barrel, and a president who told the world yesterday that a massive attack is under active consideration. This was not an accident. Everything that follows came from the decision, made sometime in the last 72 hours, that the current operational tempo is insufficient. But that was only the beginning. Section 2. The war that broke the ceasefire, how we got here from February 28th. To understand the full operational weight of the 13th consecutive night of strikes, you need to understand the timeline that produced it, because this war did not begin with the current campaign. It began on February 28, 2026, and the arc from that date to July 24th is one of the most operationally and diplomatically complex escalation sequences in the history of modern American warfare. From February 28th, the United States and Israel launched Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, a coordinated multi-domain strike. Campaign against Iranian military infrastructure, nuclear facilities, ballistic missile production sites, and senior regime leadership. The operation killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in its opening hours, struck the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear facilities with GBU, 57 bunker buster bombs delivered by B-2 stealth bombers, and expanded within 48 hours into a conflict spanning 7 countries as Iran activated Operation True Promise Before, its retaliatory wave of missile and drone strikes against American bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. By early April, the scale of devastation on both sides, and the economic shock of oil prices cresting above $115 a barrel at their peak during March, their highest level since the 1990 Gulf War, created sufficient pressure for a ceasefire. On April 7th, hours before Trump's self-imposed deadline for striking Iranian civilian infrastructure, including bridges and power plants, Pakistan's prime minister brokered a last-minute intervention. Iran agreed to allow safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Trump agreed to suspend the bombing. A 2-week ceasefire was announced. Oil fell 15% in a single trading session. The world exhaled. But the ceasefire was never clean. It was never clean because the underlying strategic interests of both sides were irreconcilable within any framework that either party could publicly accept. Trump's stated requirements were absolute. Iran must permanently forswear nuclear weapons. The strait must be opened with no tolls and no restrictions, and Iran's ballistic missile program must be dismantled. Iran's counterposition was equally absolute. The war must end permanently. Iranian sovereignty must be acknowledged, and any nuclear arrangements must be negotiated as part of a comprehensive peace framework rather than imposed as conditions of a ceasefire. Those two positions cannot be bridged by a 2-week ceasefire and a memorandum of understanding. They require the kind of sustained diplomatic engagement, mutual confidence building, and domestic political cover on both sides that the rapidly escalating environment of the spring and early summer of 2026 made structurally impossible to achieve. And so both sides violated the ceasefire repeatedly, each accusing the other of striking first, each calibrating their violations to stay below the threshold that would formally trigger a resumption of full-scale hostilities while simultaneously advancing their operational positions and their negotiating leverage. The United States continued striking Iranian drone sites and coastal surveillance infrastructure under the rubric of defensive operations. Iran continued restricting commercial shipping through the strait and conducting sporadic retaliatory drone attacks against Gulf-based American assets. By early July, the ceasefire was a legal fiction, and the Memorandum of Understanding negotiated in late May had formally collapsed when Iran rejected a U.S. proposal presented through the Iraqi Prime Minister on July 23rd, just yesterday. Now, connect that diplomatic collapse to the operational reality of the current campaign. The 13-night strike campaign that CENTCOM has been executing is not Operation Epic Fury resumed in its original form. It is a more targeted, more sustained, more deliberately paced campaign with a specific operational objective: the degradation of Iran's ability to interdict commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The target categories confirm this: drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, maritime capabilities, communication networks. Every night of strikes is specifically designed to dismantle the infrastructure through which Iran has maintained its effective closure of the world's most critical maritime choke point. And this is where the situation changed, because that objective has not been achieved. The Strait of Hormuz remains, by every operational measure, effectively closed to normal commercial traffic. U.S. intelligence assessed going into the current campaign that Iran's underground missile and drone infrastructure, 30 bases dug into mountain ranges at depths of 400 to 1,500 feet, connected by over 100 tunnel systems, containing missile stocks that American intelligence undercounted by more than 1,000 weapons, would require a sustained and extensive campaign to meaningfully degrade. 13 nights of targeted strikes have imposed costs. They have not resolved the strait. And the failure to resolve the strait, the continued closure of a waterway through which a fifth of the world's oil transited in peacetime, is the operational and economic reality that is driving Trump toward the language of a massive attack. Because what happened next extended the crisis into a second choke point simultaneously. And this is the moment everything shifted. Section 3, the Red Sea, opens. Houthis, Saudi tankers, and the Second Front. On the morning of July 23rd, yesterday, Yemen's Houthi rebels announced that they had struck 2 Saudi oil tankers in the Red Sea using ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. The tankers, named the Encilia and the Layla, were targeted for allegedly violating what the Houthis had declared earlier in the week, a naval blockade of Saudi Arabia, a blockade framed by the Houthi military command under the equation of, in their own words, a siege for a siege. The attack forced approximately 10 additional ships to retreat and return to their ports of departure. And it did something else, something with consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate tactical incident. It pushed Brent crude oil above $100 a barrel for the first time since May, briefly touching $102 per barrel in intraday trading, before closing above $100, a 6% single. Session spike that Deutsche Bank's global head of macro research described as moving straight to the top of the global economic agenda. Now let's connect this directly to the strategic architecture of the broader conflict, because the Houthi attack on the Saudi tankers is not an isolated development. It is the activation of Iran's Second Front deterrence doctrine, the deliberate extension of the maritime pressure campaign from the Strait of Hormuz to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern choke point connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, through which an enormous proportion of global trade and European-bound energy shipments must pass. The operational logic is devastatingly simple. The United States has been conducting 13 consecutive nights of strikes specifically designed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran's proxy network can simultaneously close or threaten the Bab el-Mandeb, then the cumulative effect on global shipping is not additive, it is exponential. The Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait are the 2 maritime choke points that together control the flow of Gulf energy to European, Asian, and African markets. Closing both, even partially, even through the threat effect on insurance markets and ship operator routing decisions, rather than through kinetic ship sinkings, produces a global energy supply shock of a severity for which there is no adequate historical comparison in the post-1973 era. The Institute for the Study of War reported that by the time of the Houthi attacks on July the 23rd, at least 7 vessels had already changed course to avoid transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, responding not to confirmed sinkings, but to the declared blockade and the credible threat of Houthi interdiction. The UK Maritime Trade Organization has maintained a critical threat level designation for the Strait of Hormuz throughout the current campaign. Insurance markets, which responded to far lesser provocations in 2023 and 2024 by dramatically elevating war risk premiums, are now confronting the prospect of both major Gulf choke points simultaneously classified as active conflict zones, a scenario for which no commercial maritime risk model in current use was calibrated. Trump's response to the Houthi tanker strikes was immediate and characteristically absolute. He announced that the United States will hold Iran directly, responsible for all future Houthi attacks on shipping. He warned of major military punishment for the Houthi alliance if attacks continue. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, operating simultaneously at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Manila, alongside Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, where the Iran war and the Hormuz blockade were described as the dominant agenda items, told reporters that the Houthis had been suckered into attacking Red Sea shipping and called on the group to de-escalate. Neither of those American responses, Trump's threat of punishment or Rubio's plea for de-escalation, addresses the strategic reality that the Houthis are executing a coherent, coordinated Iranian-directed operational concept designed specifically to impose maximum economic pain on a global energy market already stretched to the breaking point by the Hormuz closure. The Houthis are not acting independently. They are the second instrument in an orchestrated dual choke point pressure campaign that Iran's military planners have been developing for years and are now executing in real time, sustained by the political legitimacy that the broader war has given Houthi leadership among its domestic constituency, sustained by the material and intelligence support flowing from what remains of Iran's military supply chain, despite 5 months of American and Israeli strikes. And the economic consequences are no longer theoretical. Brent crude above $100, a 40% price increase in a single month. Inflation expectations reigniting in every major importing economy. Simultaneously, the European Central Bank facing renewed tightening pressure just as it had begun to hope the worst of the commodity shock was behind it. The world economy, which had been cautiously absorbing the initial impact of the Hormuz closure through inventory drawdowns, emergency OPEC plus output increases, and alternative routing through the Cape of Good Hope, is now confronting the scenario. Its worst-case models had flagged, but its central case projections had not incorporated. Both major Gulf choke points disrupted simultaneously with no diplomatic resolution in sight, and an American president who was actively considering what he described, in plain language, as a massive attack. The UN Secretary General said it plainly on July 23rd. The situation in the Middle East is getting out of control. That is the most restrained possible description of what is actually happening. Section 4. Trump's decision point, the massive attack and what comes after. Let's talk about what Trump means when he says massive attack, because the phrase is not rhetorical, and the precedent for exactly what it could involve was set months ago in language so direct that it left no room for interpretive ambiguity. In early April 2026, during the days before the first ceasefire, Trump stood in front of the White House press corps and delivered one of the most explicit threats any American president has made in the history of modern warfare. Every bridge in Iran will be decimated, he said. Every power plant in Iran will be out of business, burning, exploding, and never to be used again. It will happen over a period of 4 hours, if we want it to. He dismissed questions about whether such attacks on civilian infrastructure would constitute war crimes, berating the reporter who posed the question. He threatened that a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not comply with his demands before his deadline. That threat, in April, produced the first ceasefire. Iran blinked, or appeared to blink, and the bombing paused. But that ceasefire is now gone. And Trump's statement to Axios on July 23rd, that he is considering a massive attack, that he is close to making a decision, that Israel would join in 2 minutes, is not a recycled version of April's infrastructure threats. It is something categorically different in its operational context, because it is being made after 13 consecutive nights of strikes that have already imposed substantial damage on Iran's military infrastructure, after Iran has already rejected the latest ceasefire proposal, and after the Houthis have just opened a second front that has pushed oil above $100 and threatens to push it toward the levels seen in March, when Brent briefly touched $115 per barrel. A massive attack in this context means infrastructure. It means the bridges, the power plants, the electrical grid, the water treatment network, the transportation corridors, the civilian infrastructure of a country of 90 million people that Iran's remaining leadership has explicitly warned would draw a severe and escalatory response. Mohsen Rezai, the senior military advisor to Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, made that warning with precision and deliberation on July 23rd. Attacks on infrastructure in Iran will be met with a severe and escalatory response. That is not diplomatic boilerplate. That is a deterrence signal from an organization that has demonstrated across 5 months of this conflict that it means what it says and is willing to absorb enormous punishment in service of its strategic objectives. The congressional dimension adds another layer of operational and constitutional complexity that is not receiving adequate analytical attention. The U.S. House of Representatives voted on July 23rd, yesterday again, to halt the Iran war absent congressional authorization, with some House Republicans defecting from the party line to support the measure. The Senate, in a parallel vote, failed to advance a similar resolution. This is the second time the House has passed such a measure and the Senate has blocked it. Trump has sharply criticized the Republican defectors. But the political reality is that a significant faction of the American legislature is signaling institutional opposition to the president's authority to continue escalating an undeclared war against a sovereign nation without formal authorization. And that signal, in the context of an escalation toward infrastructure, strikes on a country of 90 million people, carries legal, political, and international law implications that will define the post-conflict reckoning regardless of the military outcome. And the diplomatic environment has never been bleaker. Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, are described by an Arab diplomat as increasingly pessimistic about finding an off-ramp. Iraq's prime minister, who has close ties to both Washington and Tehran, and who met with Trump earlier this month before traveling to Tehran on July 23rd to personally appeal for peace and dialogue, has not produced a breakthrough. The ASEAN Regional Forum in Manila, where Rubio and Lavrov were simultaneously present, was dominated by calls for a peaceful settlement, calls that have produced no operational result. Iran's foreign minister called Trump's threats to Oman, whose mediation channel has been one of the few remaining diplomatic pathways, manifestly unlawful and criminal. Every diplomatic off-ramp is closing. Every military escalation option is remaining open. The president is close to a decision on a massive attack. The Houthis have just opened the Red Sea. Oil is above $100. Iran has rejected the latest ceasefire proposal. And CENTCOM has just completed its 13th consecutive night of strikes, with no operational pause announced or implied. The war that the world was assured in April was moving toward resolution is now deeper, wider, more economically destructive, and more strategically dangerous than it has been at any point since the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury on February 28th. The ceasefire was temporary. The diplomacy was theater. The operational pause was a reload. And whatever comes in the next 48 hours, whatever decision emerges from the White House in the wake of 13 consecutive nights of bombs falling on Iran, it will not be the end. It will be the escalation that makes all previous escalations look restrained. The countdown is not coming. It is already running.